In November 1956, a pivotal event unfolded that altered the course of history permanently. The most formidable empire ever witnessed, one that had controlled a quarter of the planet's landmass, was reduced to a state of submission in merely 11 days. Not through military defeat, nor by insurrection, but via a phone call. During that call, the U.S. government issued a stern ultimatum to Britain. Cease your military actions in Egypt immediately, or we will devastate your currency. We will divest every British pound in our possession. We will block your emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund. We will observe your economy crumble. With no alternative, Britain capitulated swiftly. In mere hours, the greatest empire the globe had ever known surrendered, not to a foreign force, but to its own financial burdens, its own vulnerabilities, and the stark truth that it was no longer the dominant power it once perceived itself to be. This moment, known as the Suez Crisis, marked the final blow to British global supremacy. However, here's the aspect overlooked in education. Here's what history textbooks conveniently neglect to mention. Britain didn't decline solely due to that singular crisis. Its decline stemmed from decades of repetitive missteps akin to those America is currently making. And by 2026, those miscalculations could inevitably catch up to us. Allow me to illustrate precisely what transpired. Once you recognize the pattern, your perspective on America will transform. To grasp Britain's decline, one must first understand its ascent. In the 19th century, Britain reigned as the unrivaled leader of the global economy. The British pound wasn't merely a currency. It was the currency. When nations engaged in trade, they utilized pounds. When central banks held reserves, they were in pounds. When international agreements were drafted, they were composed in pounds. This granted Britain an almost mystical influence. They could print money for military expenses. They could borrow at remarkably low interest rates, since trust in the pound was universal. They could maintain trade deficits year after year because the world relied on their currency far more than Britain needed to balance its finances. Does this ring a bell? It should. Yet a troubling issue festered beneath the surface. By the late 1800s, an emerging economic titan was rising across the Atlantic. The United States had overtaken Britain as the world's most significant economy. American factories surpassed British production capabilities. American ingenuity outmatched British innovation. American wealth was expanding at a rate faster than Britain's. Nonetheless, the pound continued to hold sway. Why? Due to a phenomenon economists describe as inertia. The global community was accustomed to using pounds. The financial framework was established around pounds. Transitioning to a new system would be cumbersome. Consequently, despite a weakening economic base, Britain's currency remained robust for a time. Then World War I erupted. Britain incurred astronomical debts to finance the conflict. By the cessation of hostilities in 1918, Britain had transitioned from the world's largest creditor nation to one of its most significant debtor nations, heavily indebted to everyone, primarily the United States. However, rather than confronting this new situation, rather than recalibrating their expenditures and ambitions to reflect their diminished status, Britain made a critical mistake. They endeavored to act as if nothing had shifted. In 1925, they committed what many historians label one of the most significant economic misjudgments of the 20th century. They returned to the gold standard based on the pre-war exchange rate. They aspired for the pound to hold the same value as it did before the war, even though Britain itself was no longer worth what it had been pre-war. This was sheer pride, stark denial, and it was catastrophic. To uphold this artificially inflated value of the pound, Britain was compelled to maintain painfully high interest rates. This suffocated economic expansion. Unemployment surged. British exports became excessively pricey for global consumers. Meanwhile, British officials continued to spend as though they still dominated the planet. They retained military installations worldwide. They financed an empire beyond their means. They borrowed incessantly. Does any of this sound familiar yet? The fissures truly began to appear in the 1930s. During the Great Depression, speculators began targeting the pound. They could see the arithmetic didn't add up. Britain was expending more than it earned, borrowing more than it could honor, and assuming that mere reputation would sustain the entire system. In 1931, Britain was completely forced off the gold standard. The pound plummeted nearly 30% in value overnight. Yet, here lies the astonishing fact. Despite facing this embarrassment, the pound continued to be a significant reserve currency. Why was this the case? It was largely due to the British Empire itself. Britain compelled its colonies to maintain their reserves in pounds. India, Australia, Pakistan, and numerous other territories had no alternatives but to utilize British currency. Essentially, Britain was holding its own colonies captive to support its failing financial network. Interestingly, America is currently engaging in a strikingly similar approach. The petrodollar system, where oil is exclusively priced in dollars, has coerced the globe into holding American currency against their will. The distinction lies in the fact that colonies eventually achieve independence, while oil-producing nations eventually grow weary of American foreign policy. Then came World War II, with Britain borrowing even more extensively, accumulating debts surpassing £14 billion, an astronomical figure for that time. By 1945, Britain owed more than its entire economic output for a year. The empire was effectively bankrupt, surviving solely on American loans and the patience of the United States. Yet, British leaders continued to deny the truth. They maintained military deployments around the globe, pretending to be a superpower, and kept spending what they did not possess on the prestige they could no longer sustain. This leads us to 1956, the moment everything finally unraveled. When Egypt's president nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain viewed it as a challenge to their authority, a threat to their access to Middle Eastern oil, and an affront to their imperial pride. Alongside France and Israel, Britain initiated a military invasion to reclaim the canal. The military operation was, in fact, achieving success. British forces were advancing and Egyptian resistance was faltering. However, Britain had neglected a vital aspect. They were no longer the world's banker. America had assumed that role, and America was furious. President Eisenhower viewed the invasion as outdated colonialism, precisely the type of conduct that was nudging newly independent nations towards the Soviet Union. He resolved to teach Britain a lesson they would never forget. The United States threatened to unload its holdings of British pounds on the open market, which would trigger the pound's collapse, rendering Britain incapable of importing the food and oil necessary for its population's survival. Additionally, America obstructed Britain's emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund. Britain's foreign currency reserves were depleting at a staggering rate of over 100 million per week and were merely days away from total financial catastrophe. British Prime Minister Anthony Eden found himself without options. He commanded a ceasefire and a complete withdrawal from Egypt. In exchange, America permitted Britain to obtain its IMF loan. The empire had been subdued by its own creditor. The Suez Crisis unfolded over just 11 days, but in that brief period it became evident what had been true for decades. Britain was no longer a superpower. It had transformed into a debtor nation living on borrowed time and borrowed funds. The moment its creditors chose to demand repayment, the entire illusion crumbled. Now let me elaborate on why this narrative should instill fear in every American. The United States today is following the identical playbook that led to Britain's downfall. Not similar, not comparable, identical. Britain's debt-to-GDP ratio post-World War II soared above 200%. Currently, America's debt to GDP ratio is nearing 120% and rising swiftly. We have added over $2 trillion to our national debt just this year. We are borrowing $7 billion each day simply to keep the government operational. Britain forfeited its reserve currency status, partly because it kept funding a global military presence it could no longer sustain. America is currently allocating more to its military than the next 9 countries combined, with over 750 military bases in more than 80 nations. We are enforcing global order through a credit card. Britain preserves the facade of authority by compelling colonies to utilize the pound. America upholds the facade of dominance by mandating that oil transactions occur in dollars. However, that system is beginning to falter. China and Russia now engage in the majority of their trade using their own currencies. The BRICS countries are systematically developing alternative payment frameworks. Even traditional U.S. allies are starting to diversify their interests. Britain has refused to acknowledge its reduced standing and continues to behave as if it were the preeminent power. Even when hard data reflects a different narrative, America still operates as though it is 1995. As if we manufacture everything the globe requires, as if alternatives to the dollar are non-existent, as if our military can remedy every issue. That hubris cost Britain dearly. It is on the brink of costing America similarly. But here's what truly keeps me awake at night. Britain's decline was gradual, then abrupt. For decades, warning signals were evident: rising debt, industrial shrinkage, and an overstretched military. But because the pound remained robust and the empire still appeared impressive on maps, British leaders deluded themselves into thinking prosperity would continue indefinitely. Then came one crisis, just one crisis, and in 11 days, a century of supremacy crumbled. America is approaching its Suez moment. It could manifest as a failed military action that turns global opinion against us. It might arise from a financial debt crisis where Congress engages in reckless brinkmanship one too many times, leading the world to view American Treasury bonds as a risky investment. It could be a geopolitical embarrassment where we attempt to impose financial sanctions only for the target to defy us because they no longer rely on our banking network. Or it could be something entirely unforeseen, a shock that unveils a long-standing truth. America is living beyond its means, propped up solely by the world's willingness to accept our currency. The projections for 2026 are particularly concerning. The Congressional Budget Office anticipates that interest payments on the national debt will surpass $1 trillion each year. We will be allocating more towards interest than we do on defense, more than what we spend on Medicare. We will resemble a household so mired in credit card debt that minimum payments consume the majority of take-home pay. When Britain arrived at this juncture, the conclusion was swift. There was no gradual degradation, no smooth transition. One day, Britain was exerting demands. The next day, it was receiving orders. One day, the pound was a representation of global clout. The next, it became a cautionary tale. The British Empire made numerous errors during its twilight years, yet its final blunder, the one that sealed its fate, was the refusal to acknowledge the evident reality. British leaders repeated to themselves that reputation would compensate for reality, that history entitled them to a favorable future, that the world owed them something for their former glory. America is telling itself the same narrative right now. We believe that because we triumphed in the Cold War, because we developed the Internet, because we placed men on the moon, the world will perpetually accept our currency and leadership. We are under the impression that being American exempts us from the principles of economics. Every fallen empire thought similarly. The British pound did not collapse due to enemies. It fell because of decisions. decisions to spend beyond their means, decisions to borrow instead of invest, decisions to uphold pride rather than ensure solvency, decisions to dwell in the past instead of preparing for the future. America is making those identical choices each day, and the clock is ticking. I'm not sharing this to instill hopelessness. I'm sharing this because history is our most valuable teacher, but only if we are willing to learn. Britain overlooked every caution until it was too late. We still have an opportunity to forge a different path, but that window is rapidly closing. There's one more parallel I must share, and this one is perhaps the most unsettling of all. Before Suez, before the humiliation, there was a moment when Britain could have altered its trajectory. In the early 1950s, several economists and Treasury officials recognized the impending crisis. They drafted internal memos warning that Britain's financial situation was untenable. They implored political leaders to curtail military expenditure, to cease the charade, to accept the new reality of a post-imperial world. Those warnings went unheeded. Politicians were reluctant to confront bad news. The public resisted acknowledging decline. Newspapers branded the pessimists as traitors and defeatists. Everyone wished to believe that Britain retained its greatness, its power, its uniqueness. Thus, the expenditure persisted, borrowing continued unabated, and denial endured until November 1956, when reality could no longer be overlooked. America finds itself in precisely that moment right now. The warnings are ubiquitous. The Congressional Budget Office has been alerting us to unsustainable debt for years. Economists from all political backgrounds concur that the current path is a mathematical impossibility. Former Treasury secretaries, Federal Reserve leaders, and even Wall Street figures are openly cautioning that change is imperative. Yet, like in Britain, these warnings are being disregarded. Politicians relentlessly pledge tax reductions and new spending initiatives. The public continues to anticipate services without compensating for them. Anyone who highlights the numbers is dismissed as a naysayer or an alarmist. We even have our own version of the British fixation on the gold standard. Britain wrecked its economy attempting to maintain an exchange rate that no longer mirrored reality. America is jeopardizing its economy by striving to uphold a lifestyle that no longer aligns with reality. We consume more than we produce. We spend more than we earn. We are indebted to the future to finance the present. And we convince ourselves this can continue indefinitely because we are America. Let me clarify what occurs when a reserve currency declines. It's not just an abstract economic principle. It results in devastation for everyday individuals. When the pound plummeted, British citizens observed their savings diminish. The cost of imports skyrocketed. Inflation eroded wages. Jobs vanished as industries dependent on inexpensive foreign inputs could no longer compete. The standard of living that the British populace had taken for granted dissipated within a generation. If the dollar forfeits its reserve currency status, every American will feel the repercussions. Everything we import, which encompasses nearly everything we consume, will dramatically increase in price. Mortgage, car loan, and credit card interest rates will surge. The government will have to either reduce services, raise taxes, or both. The comfortable American middle-class lifestyle will fade into memory. This is not fear-mongering. This is history. This is precisely what befell Britain. This is exactly what occurs when a debtor nation loses its creditors' trust. What troubles me most is the timeline. Britain's shift from perceived strength to evident weakness unfolded over approximately 30 years, from 1920 to 1950. However, the final collapse, when it arrived, took less than 2 weeks. America's transformation has been ongoing since at least the 1970s, when we abandoned the gold standard. We have recorded trade deficits every single year since 1975. We have been accumulating debt at an accelerating rate since the 2008 financial crisis. The foundation has been deteriorating for 50 years, which implies that the collapse, when it arrives, will be even more abrupt than Britain's was. I cannot predict whether that collapse will occur, specifically in 2026. No one can foresee the exact moment when confidence unravels. However, I do know that each passing year without substantial change exacerbates the eventual reckoning. Every $1 trillion we add to the debt, every factory we offshore, every month we spend beyond our earnings brings us closer to our very own Suez moment. The query is not whether America will confront its Suez moment. The question is whether we will be ready when it arrives, whether we will have developed the resilience, savings, and genuine productive capacity to withstand the turmoil, or whether we will find ourselves like Britain in November 1956, helplessly witnessing as decades of denial engulf us in a matter of days. What actions can you take? First, recognize that the government will not rescue you. British citizens who placed their faith in their government to manage the transition lost everything. Those who safeguarded themselves, diversified their assets, and cultivated real skills and savings were the ones who thrived. The same will hold true here. Second, remain vigilant to the warning indicators. When you observe foreign central banks decreasing their dollar reserves, when you see significant nations entering agreements to trade in alternative currencies, when you notice interest payments on national debt surpassing military spending, be aware that the clock is ticking more quickly. Third, do not allow normalcy bias to blind you. The most perilous phrase in finance is, "This time is different." Every fallen empire believed it was unique. Every collapsed reserve currency was held by individuals unable to envision a world without it. History is indifferent to our beliefs. It only pays heed to mathematics. History does not repeat, but it does echo. And at this moment, the echo between Britain then and America now is strikingly similar. Identical debt patterns, shared military overreach, the same arrogance, the same blindness to what lies right before us. The last blunder of the British Empire was its assumption that it was immune to downfall. America is currently repeating that very error. We find ourselves in the resonance of history, treading paths that lead to a precipice. Yet the majority are too at ease to take notice. The only inquiry that remains is whether we will awaken in time or if 2026 will mirror our 1956. I will see you in the next one. Subscribe